Hello, everyone. I'm Mariette DiCristina, Dean of Boston University's College of Communication. I'm also a COM alum and the parent of a recent BU grad. It's my real pleasure to introduce you to today's discussion and welcome you. Above the Shouting, Communicating in Today's Washington. Today's event is part of our series of virtual events that we call Com Talks, featuring topics and experts in journalism, advertising, public relations, film, television, and media science. Today's event will be recorded and will be available for folks to watch later online on COM's website and also on its YouTube channel. After yesterday's midterm elections, we're left to wonder, will division and discord deepen in Washington? Or will the results force the two parties and the interest groups behind them to inch together to get something done? And how will today's communication strategies and media environment help shape those answers? They're kind of tough questions. Unfortunately, we've assembled an expert panel of College of Communication alums who are representing different sectors of the political communications world to share their insights with us today. So let me introduce them. First, let's say hello to Sujata Mitra, who's Executive Vice President and Head of Earned Media Strategies at Edelman's Washington, D.C. office. There, she leads the earned media team and serves as strategic senior media counsel to clients, C-level executives, and client partners on how to effectively communicate stories and messages to target audiences. Previously, she led communications and media relations efforts for Vox Media's news and technology brands. Before that, she was Senior Director of Communications for the Huffington Post and the Director of Marketing Communications for CQ Roll Call, the Economist Group, and spent several years at DKC and Allison Partners, two leading public relations agencies. Prior to working in PR and communications, Sujata was a journalist, receiving an Emmy for the station's one-year 9/11 anniversary coverage. And she's, I'm proud to say, a 2000 graduate of COM. Nice to see you, Sujata.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining. Now let's say hello to Grant Leslie, who's global head of the FGS Global Food Team, where she works with a wide array of corporate, nonprofit, and coalition clients, helping them manage advocacy and reputational campaigns, as well as providing them with public policy and strategic communications advice. Grant joined FGS Global from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, where she served as senior advisor to Secretary Tom Vilsack, serving as liaison between the USDA, the White House, and other federal departments, oversaw the Senate confirmation of high-level political appointees for the agency, and advised the Secretary and coordinated departmental activity on issues related to the Farm Bill, sustainability, climate, nutrition, and rural development, among others. Prior to USDA, she served as legislative director for then Senator Ken Salazar, a Democrat of Colorado, and as legislative assistant to the former Senate Democratic leader, Tom Dockley, a Democrat of South Dakota. She's a 2002 graduate of COM and CAS with degrees in broadcast journalism and political science. Welcome to you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Grant. Now let's say hello to Vincent Morris, who is Vice President of Public Affairs at Clyde Group, and who's worked at the nexus of media, politics, and strategic communications for the past 20 years. Earlier in his career, Vince spent nearly 15 years as newspaper reporter in Maryland, North Carolina, and New York. He covered 3 presidential elections and was a frequent guest on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and C-SPAN, while serving as White House and congressional correspondent based in Washington, D.C. After transitioning to public affairs, he helped steer D.C. Mayor Tony Williams through a turbulent second term, and then worked on behalf of the House Rules Committee in the 111th Congress. Later, he worked for Senator Jay Rockefeller of West Virginia, Senator Barbara Mikulski of Maryland, and Bernie Sanders of Vermont in managing media relations and strategy. He was a 6-year trustee of the DC Public Library System and is an active library volunteer. That's awesome. Vince is a 1990 graduate of COM and played varsity football for the Terriers for 4 years. Welcome to you, Vince.
Thank you so much. Very excited to be here.
So glad you're here. Finally, I'd like to welcome my dear colleague and discussion moderator, Tammy Vigil. Tammy is Senior Associate Dean and Associate Professor of Media Science here at COM. Her research interests include political campaigns, persuasion, and women as political communicators. Tammy's books include Moms in Chief, The Rhetoric of Republican Motherhood, and The Spouses of Presidential Nominees 1992 to 2016, and Connecting with Constituents, Identification Building and Blocking in Contemporary National Convention Addresses. Thanks a million, Tammy, and welcome to you. And thanks to all. I'm sorry. And thanks to you all again for attending today's discussion. Let me turn it over to you now, Tammy. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Mariette. And thanks for the warm welcome for everybody. So thank you all for joining us. Thanks to the panelists, and thank you out there in the audience for joining us for today's conversation, which we hope will be a lively and interesting one, just like the election seemed to be lively and interesting. Before we dive in, a couple of words about format for the audience. I'll get the ball rolling with a few questions, but in a little while, members of the online audience will be able to pose their own questions to the panelists. If you do have a question, please be sure to post it in the Q&A tab on Zoom, not in the chat, because it'll be easier for us to keep track of those questions there and to make sure that we can try to fit in as many questions as we possibly can. So again, try the Q&A, use the Q&A tab for questions, please. All right, so let's get started with the midterms, at least the voting part over. Some races still aren't quite clear about what the results are yet. I'm sure everyone has a variety of reactions, questions, just sort of general thoughts. So why don't we just go around and have a little conversation about what we've just witnessed. After all, we are all here political animals, as we should be, and engaged individuals. So let's just start off with a quick round of initial responses to the elections. What are some of your hot takes on the election and possible implications for communicators in and around the Beltway? So I'll let y'all just jump in, or I can call you by name. What would you prefer?
Grant, do you want to take it first?
Sure, I'm happy to. A few thoughts from me. I think one of the main things that everybody's talking about, so this is not a hot take from me, but what we're hearing all over the place is that it was not a red wave, maybe a little bit of a red splash, which was surprising, I think, for everyone. I think that, another thing is that we don't exactly know how this is going to play out. As you just said, there's a couple elections that are not called. It looks like the House for sure is going to be in the hands of the Republicans, but we're not sure about the Senate, and we're not going to know for a few weeks. Depending on how Nevada is called, maybe we know a little sooner, but likely we won't know until there's a runoff in Georgia. And so that means that we're in limbo for a little bit longer, similar to how we were several years ago. But under any scenario, it's going to be really, really tight. And I think that's important. To know that we're still in a truly divided place, which means a lot of the rhetoric and sort of the planning isn't going to change that much. There are procedural things that will fundamentally change based on, if the Senate is in the hands of the Republicans versus the Democrats. But I think the world in which we're all operating, we're seeing this very, very divided place. And so that sentiment is going to continue and is really going to feed into the next couple of years until the presidential. There's certainly a lot of conversations about what this means for Trump and Republican and DeSantis and all of this. And so I think we'll see that play out some more. But it really is interesting to see that it wasn't a wave, and that this division, this very, very divided country is really where we are.
Thanks, Grant. Sujata, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think from a media perspective and an earned perspective, as we're thinking about communicating, I think this clutter and this noise of all this news, I think it's exactly that. I was thinking about this topic this morning, and I was trying to put it into perspective. And if we just think about the last few years and what reporters have been dealing with, it's this never-ending breakneck, tumultuous news cycle. First they had 2016, then the Trump presidency, then COVID, then the 2020 election cycle, then George Floyd, then Ahmaud Arbery, the insurrection, Ukraine, Roe v. Wade, the midterms, and then over the last several months, the fears over the economy. And then today, in addition to the midterms, the tech industry's historic layoffs. So I think all of this, plus what's to come in 2023 with inflation and the global economy, reporters are just inundated with this news cycle. So all that to say, I think the threshold for communicating in a way that actually breaks through is immensely high. It's been high, but it's now even higher than it was. So, what we always say is we're really pushing our clients to think through, what are you trying to say that's timely, and what is the news value that it's bringing to your audience and the reporter's audience, because that's what it's going to take to really earn that coverage and that attention as you're trying to communicate during what the election cycle will be, which is not, it hasn't ended yet. We still don't have results. And then this is just bleeding into 2024.
That's great insight. And I think, just one thing I want to kind of point out from what you're saying there is to underscore the idea that we as viewers sometimes and consumers of messaging get really exhausted from the bombardment and don't often stop to think about the people who are actually having to go in, get the information, format it, put it together, and then give it out to us. So the exhaustion that must be felt by the journalists, but also by other political communicators is something that we don't often talk about. So thank you for bringing that up. Vincent, do you want to add some of your hot takes in response?
Sure. I don't think I would call it a hot take, but my sense of the election is that I think one, I'm immensely gratified that there was not any kind of broad efforts to create violence or have confrontation at polling places. From what I've read and seen, I think that honestly, a week ago, leading up to the election, I was quite worried about, because of what's happening with Twitter, because of the part of the country that still believes President Trump was wrongly denied a presidency, and this was the next election after the one that saw him defeated. I had honestly some great fears about what might happen at polling places, given what happened in the last cycle, intimidation of poll workers, and contesting of results. I know we've seen a little bit of that, but nothing like what we were prepared for. So honestly, I was quite pleased with that. Not even getting into the results, honestly, not turning this into anything of my personal belief, but I think that just the fact that the elections managed to be carried out in a way that seems to be in a good place, other than small isolated complaints here or there, as long as they stay kind of on the back burner and it doesn't become a full out revolution, I think we're in a better place. I would say for purposes of communicating election results, I think that puts us in a better place, because I think that to the extent that the conversation can be about the policies and the individuals and the actual leaders, the results of the elections, rather than how the elections were carried out or whether they were fairly carried out, I think we're in a much better place. So overall, I'm basically pleased with how I think most of yesterday went. I watched Tim Ryan's concession speech in Ohio and just thought he just had the perfect tone for trying to remind everybody, that the elections are larger than any one individual. So I think if we see that around the country as the results in these last few races become certified, and in the runoff in Georgia next month, I think if we get that from our leaders, we'll be in a much better place. And I'll be a little, heartened about, what that foretells for the next 2 years.
Great. Well, thanks. And I would agree with you. I think the ways in which the people who don't win tend to handle their defeat often can help set the tone in terms of the conversation. But one of the things that we've been hearing for quite a while now is we've been bombarded with this message about the toxicity in Washington. I think the word toxic shows up just so frequently. And there's a lot of concern about the inability for people to sort of cross this huge or allegedly huge partisan divide. So Grant, Sujata, sorry, Vincent, you're all in the thick of things there in DC. We'd love to hear an on-the-ground perspective. Is it really as toxic? I mean, you're seeing this from a whole lot of different kinds of perspectives. Is it as toxic as it seems, or is it a bit overblown? Has that storyline kind of just been exaggerated a bit? Why don't we start with Vincent, since we ended with you last time?
Thank you, Tammy. Sure. So I'm of the opinion that it actually is worse than it was before. I know there's some people who say, well, Congress has had members of Congress get on fights in that in the well of the House floor, and there's always been insults, and it was before Trump was impeached, President Clinton was impeached, and the country was so divided at that time. I believe all the to be true, but I think that what we see nowadays is, as I mentioned, in terms of this larger rejection of the election results. What we have now is people rejecting news, rejecting the notion of what truth is as it's communicated in what we'd like to think are trusted outlets. I think that a generation ago, even if you didn't like what was in the New York Times, you accepted it. You might shake your head and disagree, but I don't think that there was this actual mistrust. And I think that unfortunate lack of faith in some of the institutions that communicate, that convey news, that I think honestly has been worsened by some media outlets. I'm not going to get into that unless we need to, but I think that general erosion of what we used to have as some norms has mushroomed into now our elected leaders have embraced that and embraced that narrative. And that's really unfortunate. The North Carolina race is a great example. So the senator-elect there, it's fine if North Carolina was going to elect a Republican. That should be, that's the will of the voters there. But to have someone elected who was, when he was a House member, I'm not going to get into politics if I can avoid it, but when he was a House member, actively was challenging the election results. Was one of those House members who I think he sent a letter to the Attorney General asking for an investigation. So actively encouraging doubts and skepticism in our processes is really so unfortunate and so damaging, really, to the larger fabric. And that's honestly what I worry about more. And I think, unfortunately, the skepticism in the news has created this, domino effect where our political leaders, some of them, take advantage of that. And I'm worried about what that means for the future.
So Vincent's saying it's not overblown, it's actually maybe underreported, and that it might be actually worse than we're hearing, or than we're assuming. Grant, what do you think about it? About the toxicity levels?
Well, I will admit, I have been working in politics in DC long enough that I'm pretty jaded, and I'm usually always the Debbie Downer. But coming off what Vince just said, let me try to say a little bit of positivity here, because I do think things are incredibly toxic. But I come from the policy side of things, which is a different form of communications, right? And I specifically spend the majority of my time working on food and agriculture policy with a wide array of clients. And one thing that I will say is that, because there is so much toxicity with existing institutions, it's also created a space for new voices to come in and understand the importance of engagement, because they feel that if they do not speak up, they will not be represented, and they don't even feel like the way maybe they have historically been represented is the right way. So I can say, I do a lot of work in the agriculture and climate space. And when I was working in the Obama administration, not that long ago, but it feels like a very long time ago, you couldn't get many people in the agricultural community to talk about climate. And now it's really the top thing that people in the agricultural community, everyone from farmers to large food companies, want to talk about, because they see the importance, they see their place in a solution. And there's a conversation to be had in that space. And so there are people coming to the table on some of these policies that had never been there before. And so I do think that this divisiveness, does create some spaces for people to understand the importance of engagement and try to figure out where it makes sense for them to engage. That doesn't make it any easier necessarily to navigate the toxicity sometimes, but I actually am really excited about some of the people that I am seeing engage in the public policy space that have previously been very passive and on the sidelines.
So there's a little bit of hope, lots of toxicity, but still a little bit of hope for some positive outcomes from the toxicity that Grant is.
I'll give you that little bit of hope.
A little bit of glimmer. Sujata, what do you think?
No, I mean, I totally agree with Grant. I mean, look, it's been a rough 4, 5, 6 years now, and I think the toxicity in terms of just the wide difference between points of view, and it has never been, as bad as it could be today. I think the insurrection specifically for people that live in DC was very difficult, right? And I think, but what came out of that, I found, not just with my clients, but others too, is that there was a willingness from corporations to be bold and stand up for what they believe to be true and be very outspoken in terms of standing behind what they believed in, no matter what the repercussion could be. And I think so out of, to Grant's point, so out of all of this very difficult, last several years, comes a real willingness to take action and to be bold and to be outspoken and to stand up for, things that, people believe to be right. I think also, people have been empowered to amplify their voices in ways that they haven't before. You've got, with the advent of TikTok, you've got people just becoming their own thought leadership platforms and becoming influencers in their own right by just speaking their mind. And I think so had we, coming out of all this, you do have more amplified voices, more empowered voices, and then many more corporations willing to say things and do things that they wouldn't have in the past.
Sure. That's terrific insight in terms of the impact that media has in giving voice. So yeah, again, a little bit of hope. We're just seeing a tiny bit of a sliver of optimism, at least from 2 of the 3 of you. But hopefully we can get to some conversation about how we might amplify some of that hope and that positivity as we kind of move along. And maybe toward that end, maybe we could give a little bit of context to our audience. You've all been in Washington for a while now. Thinking back to sort of your early days in DC, can you talk a little bit about how things might have changed for professionals like you from your early days to now, thinking about the technology, the attitude, the environment, just to kind of give us a little bit more context for understanding what you're seeing now as well. So Sujata, would you like to start us off?
Sure. One of my first jobs in DC was, let me just go back. One of my first jobs in DC was a producer for the McLaughlin Group, which doesn't exist anymore. So that dates me. But one of my early jobs in PR in DC was for Roll Call. And Roll Call still had, their print paper, and they were just like online. And, they were experimenting with subscriptions, but members of Congress still got their news from that physical paper copy of Roll Call that would go on every single member's desk, every morning. And so you think about that to where we are today, where everything is a notification on your phone, and, forget Twitter, you're not even getting it right away from Twitter, you're getting it in all these other platforms. So I think the way audiences consume their information has completely and dramatically changed. And whereas in, maybe 10, 15 years ago, you wake up in the morning, you watch the morning shows, you maybe read the paper, and that's kind of what sets the direction for the day. Everybody remembers how West Wing and how they talked about the news cycle. Now the news cycle changes every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes. It's a tweet. And this is what reporters said during the Trump administration, that every time he tweeted, it was a whole new news cycle. And so the news cycle was changing every several minutes. And that was really hard for the, media industry and the reporters. And to go back to the breakneck speed comment, I think the other piece is the way a story can start and how a company can be brought into the story, or how an association can be brought into a story, is totally different now. So it could start with a Reddit thread. It could start with, an Instagram story. It could start in so many different ways. And for communicators, it's like, when we figure out like, hey, a reporter is asking us if we want to comment on this, it's like, you got to like dig in and figure out, where did this thing even start? And it's much more dynamic and complicated now than it ever was before.
I like that phrase, dynamic and complicated. So I think that's a great encapsulation of the way that it sure seems to appear now. So Vincent, would you like to jump in?
Sure, I agree with what Sujata characterized as like the pace, the fast pace of the news cycle. And I do think we are in some uncharted territory, because I think what has happened with Twitter over the last decade in terms of the way it has impacted politics and communication, so both fields tremendously, is kind of evolving into something new. We don't really know what it's going to become. I think that by the next presidential election in 2 years, it may feel very different from what it's felt like for as long as we can remember, which is feeding this constant fast pace of news consumption, where people hate it, but they can't help get on it, and they're doom scrolling through tweets of people that they follow, politicians or commentators or whomever, and it just can constitute this crazy spiral that is not necessarily good for the discourse. I think that there's a lot of changes at hand. Obviously, Elon Musk has talked about charging. I think that the tone and what's acceptable in terms of the way people can words and the type of tweets that people can send on Twitter now are seemingly being reviewed, and there may be more. I think there's more reports of racist language being tolerated. I think the new owner of Twitter has talked about taking a lot of the filters off and making it much more of a free-for-all. My understanding is that our firm, and I've heard other firms recommending that some of our clients be very cautious about being on Twitter right now, because it is a free-for-all and kind of an unknown element. I've read where some people are planning to get off of Twitter or to avoid paying to be a certified account, a blue check. So the problem is I don't know how those corporations or government entities or sports teams or whatever, I don't know where they replace that if they get off Twitter. So it's almost like it's become this self-fulfilling prophecy that we need to have this giant echo chamber for everybody to speak with. And obviously, Twitter has been enormously valuable around the world in other countries, not just in the United States, and has produced a lot of good. But I do think there is a lot that will be changing, and we don't know where it's going to end up. And I hope that it turns for the better. I'm worried, though, not to be a downer, but I'm worried that some of the worst characteristics of Twitter that we've seen may continue and may even be amplified under the new ownership structure, which seems to be much more kind of a free-for-all, Wild West type of atmosphere, where people can say almost anything with impunity. And I don't think that's good for the discourse or good for our democracy, overall.
Sure, I think that makes sense. It'd be interesting to see too what role Mastodon, because now that's become the new, everybody keeps talking about, I'm going to switch over to Mastodon, but then there are questions about whether or not Mastodon is a little too siloed, and so then that would create bigger echo chambers, and so there's a lot to still be explored in terms of potential new media or potential different platforms for that particular fulfilling that particular need.
I would just add to Vince's point with Twitter is misinformation, right? Like, I think, this is a big concern too, because, for so long, Twitter did have a way of ensuring misinformation did not drive the news cycle and did not drive the audience mindset. And, where is Twitter's policy now going on misinformation? And so I think that's a big watch out.
Sure. I think that's a great word of warning. Grant, let's get you involved here a little too, because I know you've been in DC for a while, and you worked with a couple of well-known moderate senators, and now it sort of seems, or some people have been making the argument that there's not much space for moderate politicians anymore. And so kind of blending the notion of your experience and how things have changed over time as you've been in Washington, and also thinking about the role of moderates in political communication and the broader conversation. What do you think about these shifts and changes? And is there space for moderate conversation? If so, how do we have it? And also, how does technology kind of play a role in all of this?
Yeah, well, I think I'll take your question sort of separately. I think regarding moderates, I think that sort of the definition of moderate has sort of changed, right? When I was working for Tom Daschle, for example, who was the Democratic leader for many years and was from South Dakota. I mean, he was considered a moderate here in DC, but in South Dakota, he was considered way too liberal. And that was part of the reason why he ended up not getting reelected when he did. And so I think, if we're talking about moderates in terms of how we interact with each other and talk to each other, I think that's one thing. If we're talking moderates, just specifically based on your voting record, the moderates that I voted for, they were voting with Democrats all the time. They were pretty reliable votes. So I think the whole conversation has shifted, and we're having these conversations about purely sort of Democrats or Republicans. I don't think oftentimes politicians these days are being looked at individually. They're being looked at as you need to be a representative of everything this party stands for, which I don't think is really where exactly the national conversation in politics was 20, 25, 30 years ago. So I think that has changed a lot. And I think in terms of, educating people, we were just, and media, we were just, you guys were having a conversation about how people are consuming information and what information are they consuming, and it, is it true, and how can we, understand these sources? And I think that's also a huge question in terms of how policy is developed as well, and how information is getting to policymakers. Again, we were sort of talking about the translation of the policy, but, when I started in DC, people were still writing letters into their senators, and people were responding to those letters. Letters come in a little bit, but people are interacting with their members of Congress in a much different way. They can tweet at them, and you can tweet much more angrily. When you're writing a letter, we used to get some angry letters in the office, but it's still sort of written down, and you sort of temper yourself a little bit after a while. And so how people are interacting with their members of Congress has totally changed as well. And in one way that's exciting, because there's ways to interact with members of Congress now through social media that, brings them closer, but it also can be dangerous for all of the reasons that we were talked about. And I think also in terms of policy development, again, when I was first starting, the only way to sort of get information about what was happening on the ground in the states that I was working for was going to those states and talking to people directly, which is still the best way to do things probably. But there's a lot more ways for staff and policymakers to get incoming right now about what's happening on the ground, and figuring out the way to figure out if that's truthful, if that really is what's happening, or if it's just something that's happening to one or two people. It forces policymakers and their staffs to think about things differently as well, and adds a different layer of complication. So both in terms of the truth of how you're translating the policy and how the public is perceiving it, but also what they are getting and what they do with that information from constituents in their states as well.
Yeah. that's a whole lot. There's a whole lot to
That's a
unpack
whole
in
lot.
there. Yeah, and it's fantastic though, and a lot of great things to think about. I mean, from the beginning part of, you know, just how we change our perceptions of what moderate means to how we interact, just moving through all of this, it's just so dynamically different, right? And there's so much to get involved and or to consider and to sort of tease apart in all of this if you're going to be an effective communicator in Washington on any level. So I'm curious. You know, we've got a question here about, you know, this might be unfair, but given the fractured media ecosystem, as you all have been talking about here with this, with social media, with lots of different kinds of ways in which we're communicating, how can we start to create a national conversation outside of the strong legacy media? Is there something that we can do to sort of have that conversation?
Yeah.
Is there something we can do? How can we get that started? How can we nurture that conversation in a space that people feel they can come together in?
Yeah, so one of the things that I always counsel clients is that it's not about legacy media as like where you go first when you're thinking about where am I going to try to get coverage to ensure, you know, this thing I want to talk about is in the press. It's about where is the audience you're trying to reach getting their information. And what I always feel pretty strongly about is that audiences aren't a monolith. Like they're not like waking up in the morning and only reading the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. They're really getting their information in different ways. What I also push on is 50% of this country is diverse. So you think about where your audience is getting their information. Think about the Griot, Blavity. Think about you know, some of the Spanish language outlets. Think about NBC Asian America. Think about, you know, there are multiple different newer outlets that are so strong and that audience is so quality and they get so much engagement and that the stories they tell are really authentic to the communities that they cover, that you really have to, you know, think about your comms plan, not just, oh yeah, here is like the top 5 national outlets that I really want to be in because I want to be in a top tier outlet. No, it's about making sure the media that you're engaging with the right stories actually reaching the audience that you're trying to reach. And so I really push to diversify all comms plans with, you know, new unexpected forms of media outlets, you know, with stories that, you know, give you a direct connection to your audience versus just thinking like, oh, I need to go to, you know, your top legacy outlet.
Sure. So broadening the way we think about outlets, not and audience, both simultaneously.
Yes, and diversifying the stories that you tell. The biggest thing that reporters tell us, and not to say that those outlets are not equally important, they are. However, it's not like a singular path. You should diversify the outlets. So the number of outlets, the way you engage those outlets, and the types of story. And one of the things that reporters often tell us is that they really want to hear diverse voices. So as you're thinking about, you know, who's going to be your spokesperson and who is going to be the communicator, think about how is that person diverse? Is that person bringing an interesting or insightful point of view? Tell them something they don't know. Tell them something that's bold. Tell them something that's differentiating. So really kind of thinking through that.
So Sujata, you just made me think a little bit about this in a slightly different way. In the diversification of outlets and messaging and thinking about your audience in diverse kinds of ways, I think it's a wonderful idea. But can that create sort of a fractured perspective? Is there a way to build unity around that diversity?
I think if you're thinking from a communications point of view, your role as a communicator is to really reach all your audiences, right? Not just a singular audience. And so if you're going to do that, you really got to meet people where they are, and people are getting their information in a whole bunch of different ways. So, you know, it's important that from a comms perspective, your comms strategy is integrated. You know, I always say as the earned person is the person that's responsible for the media coverage. Like media is not going to be the one thing that's going to achieve your goals, you really got to bring in social, you got to bring in paid, you got to bring in influencer, you got to bring in policy. Like, you got to bring all the components of comms in to really work together, because people are getting their information all different places. So you want to make sure you're meeting them where they are.
Great, thanks. One quick reminder to the audience, if you have a question, feel free to pop it into the Q&A tab so that we can share your questions and kind of get some answers for you on those. But I'd love to hear Grant and Vincent jumping in on this idea of, how do we deal with the notion of legacy media, creating these national conversations, and what Sujata's kind of given us to think about in terms of diversity of audience and of outlets.
I'll just say, so Sujata is 100% right. There is no longer, a one sense of a media outreach strategy. The media is fractured, and to your point, Tammy, that can be dangerous because everyone is hearing from different points. But I feel like that the cow is out of the barn, so to speak, on that. I think there is no longer, the days of Walter Cronkite delivering the news, and the whole nation listening. It's just, that's long since been gone. I think what's just as interesting is the diversity of media that Sujata was talking about in terms of different culture, is the enormous gap in age, because I think that I'd love to hear if anyone on is listening on this panel who's younger than 24, because I think that, well, I'm obviously not, and my sense is that anyone that age is not bothering with any traditional news sources at all. I saw a study from Pew last month that was amazing, because it talked about how much more younger Americans are turning not to Facebook, but literally to TikTok as their primary source of information, and that it was growing, that the number of people who were turning to Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, etc. For news was diminishing, but that TikTok has been on a steady ascent for the last couple of years and does not show any signs of slowing down. And I realized that I think that's something that that's an evolution that I don't think anyone really is prepared to say how it will affect things long term. We have, the whole bizarre notion that that company is owned by the Chinese government essentially, and may well be collecting data on everyone in the United States who uses it, facial scans and demographic information. But I mean, is that a problem? The fact is, it is a medium that is very effective at sharing and telling stories. And that's ultimately what we're in the business of. And what I've said from the days when I was at COM and was learning how to be a reporter from my COM professors was, it all gets down to telling stories, sharing information. And if you break it down to its simplest element, it is telling a story, sharing some information, and getting the person on the other side to pay attention, whether it's you're telling a story or showing a story or writing it and they're reading it. I think that what Twitter has done is just change the way we define how a story can be told. And it seems that for people who are using and relying on Twitter as a source of news, I think that really upends a lot of what we typically would think of as regular news outlets. I mean, Univision is an outlet that primarily is geared towards Spanish-speaking audiences, whether you're Bolivian or Honduran or Mexican, but it is still a traditional news format. There is a person standing there who is doing a 4-minute segment on X, and they are telling you what to think, and that's broadcast out, transmitted around the country. Same with Spanish language or publications that are primarily aimed at Black readers or LGBT readers, whatever. All of those are all still based on traditional methods of communication, whereas TikTok is completely unconventional. There's no sense of editing or structure, and I don't really know where that's going to take us, but I'm intrigued, and I think it will definitely change. Will have a huge impact. It already is having an impact, and will have an even larger impact in election cycles to come.
I will say newsrooms are a good litmus on how audiences, your PR audiences included, get information. And there's a reason why the Post and CNN and the Daily Mail and Times of London all now have TikTok channels and TikTok producers. And one of the things we talk about is like, should we be thinking about how should we upskill or change our skills to learn how to pitch a TikTok producer? You know, which is separate from creating your own content on TikTok, because certainly brands are doing that. But should we be thinking as like communicators, thinking about, okay, what does it mean to pitch a story idea to a TikTok producer, which is a whole other area. And, you know, to Vince's point, like when we started learning about comms and how to apply PR strategies and tactics, like this is the next phase of where kind of like PR is going, not solely by itself, but it's like one area where it's new and different.
Sorry, Com just actually recently launched its first TikTok, our TikTok account. So it'd be interesting to see what our students produce for that, what we produce from that, and what kinds of response there'll be to it as well. Grant, did you want to jump in on this idea of legacy media? And there's been some really great conversations so far about sort of the different emerging platforms and the ways in which we need to kind of keep up with that, and also be aware and about how we make decisions around it. Would you like to add in anything to which panelists?
I mean, I think that the conversation's been super interesting. Maybe one thing that I'll add from a little bit of a different angle, since we've been sort of talking about tactically about engaging with legacy media, is more from the message side. I think the sort of what you say, and not just how you say it in terms of what means you deploy it, but literally what you say and how you say it is more important now than ever. Really thinking about your audience, because to Sujita's point, like it's going out to so many more people, being really thoughtful about how those different diverse audiences are going to take what you're going to say and what might happen to the type of messages when they're put out there. It really means that you sort of need to think down the line even more, because so many of these messages are living out there forever also. And so it's certainly about making sure that you have an interesting thing to say, because that's how it gets picked up, or a unique point of view. But I also think it's really important to think about how people are going to hear what you're saying, and thinking about how to really message appropriately, knowing that a more diverse audience is probably going to be hearing what you're saying.
I think that's always great advice. It's the medium, it's the audience, it's also the content, and we have to be really, really aware of how that content will continue to live on. And so being careful about that. I've got a couple of questions. We're kind of nearing the nearing time to start closing down, but I do still have a couple of quick questions for you. One a little more oriented toward the professional side, and then one that's just asking for some general advice. So let's start with the career side. Because, right now, as we talked about a little bit ago, talking politics can be a bit treacherous for clients, for individuals. So what, in your experience, are clients seeking from strategic advisors regarding their political communication? And what is it that they might not get that you wish they would actually understand more moving forward? So how can you kind of help your clients to be better, but also how can you help students and individuals who are strategic advisors? Like, what do they expected? What's expected from them or from you these days?
I think, I can start. Part of what I do is help people think about the path from A to B, right? Like, and what's going to be in the middle of that path, so that you're thinking about all the different scenarios of what could happen if you do a certain thing. And so it's figuring out what the best way to get to your goal is, but also making sure that you're prepared to navigate any landmines along the way. And so really thinking and being strategic is about how to navigate tough conversations is probably the most important thing that at least the clients that I work with are looking for right now, and really making sure that they're not surprised by things to the extent possible. There's always surprises, especially these days, and for all of the reasons that we're talking about. But so much of what we do is try to think ahead for them and think about what might happen if they engage in a certain way on a certain issue, and how to navigate that.
Great, thanks. I like that. Very strategic, forward thinking ahead. Great advice, and great ideas about what folks can do and what they need to know. So, Jana, Vincent?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, so, Edelman does the trust barometer, and one of the things that trust shows is that employees really have an expectation from their employers to kind of take a stand on issues that they believe in. And but then it's like, how do you navigate taking this action in a way that's inclusive to all your employees? And so one of the things, and we always say that it's employee driven, like your company should always speak to employees first, and then that should really be what is external facing. But what we say is there has to be an authentic connection. So why are you saying what you're saying, and why are you taking the point of view that you're taking the point of view? When it comes to politics, one of the things that's always important is that respectful and mindful of everyone's background. So, I co-lead our Asian American Employee Resource Group. And actually, the Asian American Employee Resource Group is very diverse when it comes to religious belief. And so when Roe v. Wade happened, we had to be super mindful that, while there were so many women who were like deeply, deeply upset, there were also factions of our community that, are deeply religious. And so how do you navigate something that, might be, in one sense, you think is going to be the point of view, but really it might not be, and there might be unexpected places. So it really has to come from a place of respect, but it also, as we counsel our clients, has to be employee driven first and has to be inclusive of all employees.
Great. Some good insights for folks to be thinking about, because again, treacherous times that we're in, and sometimes not thinking in a more diverse manner can make them even more treacherous, more dangerous, more difficult. Vincent?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add to it is just the most important thing, as Sujata said, was, besides authenticity, is just thinking through, whether the message that you're sending is relevant to the audience that's listening. So I do think there are times when, so all of us now, have represented clients in public relations settings where a client may feel compelled to share an opinion about something because they think they ought to. The tendency is typically to just be as cautious as possible, but sometimes they feel like there's just a fear of missing out that compels them to want to comment, issue a statement, or say something about a moment in time. I think it's important just to remember your audience and who you're speaking to. And so I usually advise them to, if you don't really have something that needs to be said, then maybe just keep your mouth shut.
Yes, sometimes people forget that silence is golden. So I think that's interesting advice too, to remember and to remind clients and to remind each other too in the sort of social realm of things as well. So that kind of brings us to another question. We kind of started off, and I have to admit this because it's just the nature of the way politics is right now. We started off on a pretty negative tone, talking about the toxicity and how horrible it is and how bad it is and the divisiveness. You all tried to offer some really nice glimmers of hope and saying, these are some of the good things that are coming out of this toxic environment that we've been in. But let's try to finish on a little bit more of a positive note and think about we are all communicators. We've all studied communication. We work in communicative fields. We're also individuals who communicate with each other. So what advice would you give? Either you can take it in either direction of clients or personally, interpersonally to folks to help create more connections and kind of get past some of this divisiveness. What communication strategies or approaches could people use in order to maybe get across that divide a little more effectively?
I'll say that I think the most valuable thing that we can and we should do is to just be deliberately, intentionally open and diverse in how we communicate. The biggest trap is to feel like your opinions are already so set and that you don't need to hear from anybody else. I encourage people to just try to be better listeners all the time and to be willing to engage with people that they haven't talked to before. A good example of that is, I work for an organization called More in Common, which if you've never heard them, you should look them up. They do some really amazing surveys of American attitudes. And one of the things they found recently, which really hit home to me, is that, in the United States, we generally have a very positive attitude towards veterans. And Veterans Day is Friday, 2 days. We kind of intrinsically have a sense that veterans should be admired, that they've sacrificed on behalf of all of us. But what it found is that very few of us actually ever talk to any veterans. And I thought about that, and I realized, on Veterans Day, find a veteran, someone that who's a veteran, and attempt to have a conversation with them. And I would say that applies beyond just Veterans Day. Of course, I'm just giving one example, but I think being intentional and deliberate about who you communicate with and being a good listener is always valuable advice.
And I like the practical aspect of where to start with that. So maybe, start with the veteran, get more comfortable, do it with another person, and that's how we grow understanding, right? Is that exchange.
Exactly.
Thank you, Vincent. Grant?
Yeah, Vincent, I think you gave great advice. I always think having conversations with people, starting a conversation is the most important step. I think it's probably the way that you have that conversation and the tone in which you have that conversation that it's the most important thing. And these days, I think it's that tone, and sometimes conversations devolve into a lack of respect. But I completely agree. We shouldn't be afraid of talking to each other and hearing different points of views, and trying to listen and put yourself in other people's shoes so that you can continue to grow and talk and hopefully have more positive conversations in the future.
Fantastic. Thanks, Grant. And quickly, Sujata, last words to you.
I agree with everything Vince and Grant are saying. The biggest thing is empathy. We need more empathy in the workplace. We need more empathy in the way we do business, and we need more empathy in the way we communicate, as well as in leadership. So I would just add that, having an empathetic voice is very important. And, I hope people enter the workforce with empathy as top of mind.
Excellent advice from all of you. Thank you so much. And that's all the time we have today. So I just wanted to say, thank you so much before we sign off. Sujata, Grant, Vincent, you've given generously of your time, your insights, and we really appreciate you for that. Thank you to the audience for tuning in. A couple of quick things to share. One is that there is a survey in the chat that you can fill out to give us a little bit of feedback on our ComTalk series. We've been doing this for a while now, especially during the pandemic in these virtual formats. And so we'd really appreciate any feedback that you could give. So see the chat for that. And secondly, we're going to have another ComTalk virtual event called Careers in the Metaverse. And you can check the chat out for some more information about that as well. You can see up on your screen right now. So again, thank you, Sujata, Grant, Vincent. Thank you all for tuning in. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll all still be glued to seeing what the rest of the results come out. So thank you very much.